I still remember the exact moment when the balance of my life quietly shifted, though at the time it felt like nothing more than an ordinary afternoon wrapped in dust, metal, and routine. The kind of moment you don't realize is monumental until you're standing far on the other side of it looking back. I had been working in the garage, the old concrete floor cold beneath my boots, the sharp scent of engine oil clinging to the air like a permanent fog, my hands blackened from grease as I leaned into the rhythm of problem-solving that had always calmed me. The kind that made sense because parts either fit or they didn't, bolts tightened or they failed, and there was no gray space between success and breakdown. For years, I had built my life around that logic, believing relationships could be repaired the same way engines could, if you just kept turning the wrench long enough and applied enough effort. My world had been shaped by responsibility and routine, by early mornings and late nights, by the weight of being someone others relied on, and I wore that weight like a badge of honor, convinced it meant I was doing something right. I had built stability brick by brick, convinced that effort equaled security, that loyalty would always be returned, and that patience would eventually be rewarded, never imagining that the person closest to me had been quietly rewriting the rules of the life we shared without ever bothering to let me read the new terms. When she finally spoke, her voice floated into the garage with unnatural calm, carrying words that sounded harmless on the surface but felt like slow poison once they settled into my chest. Words that suggested distance disguised as kindness, freedom cloaked in familiarity, and an illusion of connection that demanded none of the responsibility that real commitment required. She said we should take space, that we could still be friends, as if friendship was a downgrade you could simply switch into when the emotional weight of partnership felt inconvenient, as if the years we had spent building a life together could be reduced to something casual and conditional. I didn't react the way she expected. I didn't shout or beg or crumble, and I think that confused her more than anger ever could have. I simply nodded, finished tightening the bolt I had been working on, and allowed silence to fill the room, because something inside me had already begun to understand that her words were not a request but a declaration, not a moment of confusion, but a decision she had been quietly preparing for far longer than she was willing to admit. What she didn't realize was that by redefining us, she had unknowingly released me from every unspoken obligation I had carried for years. I had spent decades building businesses, managing teams, and raising a teenager who depended on me more than he would ever openly admit, all while believing that the steady life I provided was a shared victory rather than a one-sided sacrifice. My son had grown up watching me solve problems, handle responsibilities, and absorb stress without complaint, and though he rarely said it out loud, he noticed when the emotional atmosphere of our home shifted from tension to something closer to relief. Even before we officially acknowledged the separation, he sensed the change in the air, the way conversations grew shorter, the way doors closed more often, the way laughter became rare. And when he finally asked if things were falling apart, I didn't lie to him, because he deserved honesty more than false reassurance. He accepted the truth with quiet maturity, and what he said afterward stayed with me longer than anything else, because it hinted that the heaviness he had been living under was never invisible, that children feel the weight of unresolved conflict even when adults pretend everything is fine. It was only after she asked for this new version of our relationship that I realized how deeply I had been conditioned to provide, to fix, to rescue, and to absorb, because the first thing she did was reach out expecting me to handle something small and domestic as if nothing had changed, as if the emotional distance she demanded didn't apply to the labor she still felt entitled to receive. That was when the truth finally surfaced with brutal clarity. She didn't want separation, she wanted convenience. She wanted freedom without cost, independence without responsibility, and security without commitment. When I refused, calmly and without bitterness, she reacted as if I had broken some unspoken contract, and in a way I had, because I had finally chosen to honor her words instead of the version of us I had been clinging to out of habit. Boundaries are uncomfortable when they interrupt expectations, and she struggled to accept that friendship meant equality, not entitlement. As days passed, the pattern repeated itself in different forms, revealing how deeply ingrained her assumptions had been, because every time I declined to perform a task she once took for granted, she reacted with disbelief, frustration, and a growing sense of betrayal, as if my refusal was cruelty rather than consistency. She had asked for distance, yet still expected the privileges of partnership, and when those privileges were withdrawn, the illusion shattered. My son watched these moments unfold quietly, absorbing lessons I wished I had learned earlier, understanding that self-respect is not abandonment, and that honoring someone's choices sometimes means refusing to rescue them from the consequences of those choices. The house began to feel different, not empty, but lighter, as though years of unspoken tension were slowly lifting, replaced by a clarity that was long overdue. When social expectations collided with reality, the cracks in her carefully maintained narrative widened even further, because she had built her public image on the assumption that I would always be there to support her efforts, manage logistics, and absorb the invisible labor that made her world run smoothly. When I declined to play my old role, choosing instead to live my life according to the terms she herself had proposed, she realized too late that independence feels different when it is no longer subsidized by someone else's effort. Watching her scramble to fill the void she created was not satisfying, but it was revealing, because it showed me just how much of our relationship had been built on silent expectations rather than mutual appreciation. It was during this period of emotional recalibration that someone from her past, someone who had always lingered at the edges of our life together, stepped forward in a way that felt both unexpected and strangely natural, not as a replacement, but as a reminder that connection does not have to be transactional, that conversations can be easy, that laughter does not have to feel forced, and that being seen does not require constant justification. What began as simple companionship gradually evolved into something deeper, not because I was searching for escape, but because I had finally stopped settling for emotional scarcity. For the first time in years, I felt chosen rather than tolerated, valued rather than utilized, and that realization reshaped my understanding of what a healthy connection should feel like. The shift did not go unnoticed, and when she became aware of this new presence in my life, the irony was impossible to ignore, because the same boundaries she had insisted upon suddenly felt unacceptable when they no longer worked in her favor. She accused, questioned, and demanded explanations she was no longer entitled to, revealing that her vision of friendship had always been one-sided, designed to preserve her comfort rather than establish equality. In that moment, I understood that the conflict was not about betrayal, but about control, about losing access to a role she had never truly appreciated until it was gone. As financial truths surfaced, exposing choices she had hidden behind a carefully curated image, I realized how much of our life together had been built on illusion rather than transparency, and how close I had come to being pulled under by responsibilities I never agreed to carry. This discovery did not bring anger, only clarity, because it confirmed what I had already begun to feel. The life we shared had been ending long before she spoke the words out loud. What remained was not heartbreak, but relief, and the quiet confidence that comes from finally standing on your own terms. The legal process that followed was not dramatic, but it was definitive, marking the official end of a chapter I had outgrown long before I admitted it. And though the paperwork felt clinical, it carried the weight of transformation, of choosing forward motion over nostalgia, and of releasing a future that no longer belonged to me. My son thrived in the stability that emerged, my work flourished in the absence of constant emotional strain, and the home that once felt like a battleground slowly became a sanctuary again, filled with warmth, laughter, and a sense of possibility that had been missing for years. By the time the dust settled, I no longer felt like someone recovering from loss, but like someone rediscovering himself, embracing a life built on mutual respect rather than obligation, and understanding that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the space to walk away and find something better than what you were settling for. The months that followed unfolded like a slow sunrise after a long storm, not because every day was perfect, but because each day finally felt honest, grounded in choices that belonged to me instead of expectations inherited from someone else's version of my life. I discovered that peace is not loud or dramatic. It arrives quietly in small moments, in shared meals, in conversations that don't feel like negotiations, in laughter that doesn't carry tension beneath it. The person who had entered my life during the chaos never tried to replace what was lost, never demanded emotional urgency, never pushed for more than I was ready to give, and that patience alone revealed how unhealthy my previous reality had been. My son adjusted with surprising ease, not because he didn't care, but because children recognize authenticity long before adults do, and he could finally breathe in a home that no longer felt emotionally crowded. The simple routines we built together, late-night snacks, weekend drives, conversations about his future, felt more meaningful than any grand gestures ever had, because they were rooted in presence rather than performance. What shocked me most was how quickly my body responded to the absence of constant emotional tension, as if it had been carrying a burden it was never meant to hold. I slept deeper, my focus sharpened, my energy returned, and even my work reflected this shift, because clarity breeds productivity in ways stress never can. I began to understand that I had been living in survival mode for years, mistaking endurance for strength, believing that holding everything together was proof of love, when in reality, love should feel like expansion rather than exhaustion. The new connection in my life did not revolve around fixing or proving. It grew through shared curiosity, mutual respect, and the simple joy of being seen without having to perform. And for the first time, I felt safe enough to be fully myself rather than a version crafted to keep someone else comfortable. Occasionally, memories of the past surfaced, not with bitterness, but with a strange sense of gratitude, because without that painful unraveling, I might never have questioned the narrative I had been living inside. I realized that many people remain in unhappy situations not because they fear loneliness, but because they fear change, mistaking familiarity for security, even when that familiarity is slowly eroding their sense of self. Letting go was not an act of defeat, but of self-respect, and though it required confronting uncomfortable truths, it also opened space for a life that felt aligned with who I was becoming rather than who I had been trying to be. I stopped asking what went wrong and began asking what I had learned, and in that shift, I found compassion for myself, for her, and for the version of us that no longer existed. The person I once loved eventually faded into a distant chapter, no longer the center of my emotional landscape, but simply a part of my history that had shaped me without defining me. I no longer needed validation from her regret or acknowledgement of her mistakes, because closure did not arrive through her understanding, but through my own acceptance. I understood that growth does not require agreement, and that healing does not depend on apologies that may never come. The life I was building felt intentional, not reactive, and each step forward reinforced the belief that happiness is not found by clinging to what is familiar, but by embracing what feels true. As seasons changed, the bond between my son and the person who had become a steady presence in our lives deepened naturally, not through forced roles, but through shared experiences, honest conversations, and quiet support that never felt conditional. He began to open up more, sharing his fears, his dreams, his uncertainties, and I saw how powerful it is for a child to witness adults choosing authenticity over comfort. It taught him that relationships are not obligations to endure, but connections to nurture, and that walking away from something unhealthy is not failure, but courage. Watching him grow in confidence reminded me that the choices we make ripple far beyond ourselves, shaping the emotional landscape of those who depend on us most. There were moments when the weight of the past still whispered, especially during quiet evenings when the house settled into silence. But those moments no longer felt heavy. They felt reflective, like looking at an old photograph that no longer stirs pain, only perspective. I learned that healing is not linear, and that memories do not disappear, but they lose their power when they are met with understanding rather than resistance. The life I was living now felt expansive, filled with potential rather than regret, and I finally trusted myself to choose joy without guilt, knowing that I had earned the right to prioritize my well-being. When I reflected on the turning point that changed everything, I no longer felt anger toward the words that once hurt me, because they had served as a doorway rather than a wound, leading me toward a life that felt aligned with my values instead of anchored to compromise. What once seemed like rejection revealed itself as redirection, guiding me toward connections built on mutual respect rather than emotional convenience. I no longer questioned my worth or my decisions, because the peace I felt confirmed that I was exactly where I needed to be, no longer waiting to be chosen, but actively choosing myself. The future unfolded not as a fixed destination, but as an open horizon, filled with possibility rather than fear. And for the first time, I felt excited about what lay ahead rather than anxious about what might be lost. The home that once echoed with tension now resonated with warmth, laughter, and a sense of belonging that did not depend on perfection, but on authenticity. Every shared meal, every late-night conversation, every quiet moment reinforced the truth that love is not measured by endurance, but by the freedom to grow without restraint. I no longer saw myself as someone recovering from heartbreak, but as someone rediscovering wholeness, learning that the end of one story does not signify failure, but transformation, and that sometimes the most painful experiences are simply invitations to evolve. The journey taught me that boundaries are acts of self-love, that clarity is a gift, and that choosing yourself is not selfish, but necessary for a life that feels genuine. I stepped forward with confidence, no longer carrying the weight of expectations that were never mine to fulfill. Looking back, I understood that the moment everything changed was not when she asked for distance, but when I finally listened to what that request truly meant and chose to honor it fully, without resentment or regret. In doing so, I found a version of myself I had forgotten existed, someone capable of building a life rooted in respect, connection, and purpose. The space she created became the foundation for something far greater than what I lost, and in that space, I discovered a future that felt not only possible, but profoundly fulfilling.